The smell of old coffee and worn leather is the first thing I notice when I sit down in my attorney's office. It smells like decisions, like the kind you only make once. I count the rings on the wooden table while I wait. 14 of them. I don't know why I count. Maybe because my hands need something to do that isn't shaking. My name is Adeline. I am 63 years old, and for the past 11 days, I have been trying to figure out how a woman who spent 40 years building something can lose it all in a single afternoon, in her own son's house, at his wedding reception, in front of everyone she has ever known. I keep coming back to that afternoon, the way the light looked, the way the music was too loud, the way my son's new wife looked at me from across the room like I was furniture that had been placed in the wrong corner. I should start from the beginning. That's what my sister always says. Start from the beginning, Adeline. Don't jump to the wound. Tell the whole story. So, the beginning. I bought the bakery in 1987. It was a Thursday. I remember because the bank closed early on Fridays back then, and I had to rush across town in a car that smelled like exhaust and old upholstery to get the papers signed before 3 o'clock. My husband, Gerald, thought I was out of my mind. A bakery, he said, standing in the doorway of what would become the kitchen. You want to run a bakery? I want to own something, I told him. Something that's ours. He looked around at the chipped tile and the ancient oven and the ceiling that had water damage in the corner, and he said, "Okay, Addie, okay." He never called me Adeline, only Addie. I haven't heard that name in 11 years, not since the cancer took him. We built that bakery together, not metaphorically. I mean, Gerald actually swung a hammer, and I actually hauled bags of flour, and we stayed up until 2 in the morning, 6 nights a week for the first 3 years, trying to make something out of nothing. We hired 1 employee, then 3, then 8. By the time our son, James, was born, we had a small but steady business on the corner of Clement Street in San Francisco's Richmond district, and people came from 2 neighborhoods over for the sourdough. I raised James inside those walls. He did his homework at the table near the window. He learned to count by counting muffins. He knew every one of our regulars by name before he could read. When Gerald got sick, James was 26. He came home from Seattle to help. He slept on the couch for 3 months. He drove his father to chemo on Tuesdays and stayed through the whole thing, even when Gerald told him to go home and get some sleep. He sat with me in the hospital at the end and held my hand in the hallway outside the room because I couldn't go in. I couldn't watch. I thought I knew my son. I thought I knew exactly who he was. That was my first mistake. Her name was Priya. James met her 2 years after Gerald passed. She was smart and fast-talking, and she had opinions about everything, which I actually liked at first. I respect a woman who takes up space. Gerald always said that about me. Addie takes up exactly the right amount of space, he'd say. Priya took up all of it. The first time she came to the bakery, she walked through the kitchen without asking and started asking questions about our supplier contracts, not out of curiosity, like she was doing an audit. I laughed it off. She was nervous, probably. Meeting the mother. Trying to make conversation. The second time, she told James, while I was standing right there, that the storefront needed to be modernized if we ever wanted to compete. Compete with what? I asked. She smiled at me. It was a pleasant smile. It didn't reach anything. James looked between us and said, "She just means the signage, Mom." I didn't say anything else. But I thought about it for a long time afterward. They got engaged 14 months later. James called me on a Sunday evening, and his voice was full of joy, real joy, the kind that I hadn't heard from him since before his father got sick. I told him I was happy for him. I meant it. I wanted to mean all of it. The wedding was in October, a Saturday. They chose a vineyard in Sonoma, about an hour north of the city, and it was beautiful in the way that places are beautiful, when they have been designed to look beautiful. manicured and composed and a little bit unreal. I drove up with my sister Claudette, who is 67 and has a way of seeing straight through to the center of any situation. She sat in the passenger seat and watched the hills and said, almost to herself, I hope she knows what she has. Who? I asked. Your son, she said. He's a good man. He got that from you and Gerald both. I didn't respond. I watched the road. The ceremony was lovely. James cried. I cried. Even Claudette, who claims she hasn't cried since 1994, pressed her lips together very tightly for a long moment. But something was already off. I felt it the way you feel weather before it changes, in the pressure, in the air, in something that isn't quite a sound. Priya's mother, a tall woman named Geeta, had seated her entire extended family on what was supposed to be an integrated guest side. I found this out when I went to find my seat and discovered that James's cousins, my late husband's brother's children, people who had known James his whole life, had been moved to a back table near the exit. My seat had been changed too. I was at a table with people I had never met, Priya's colleagues from her firm. I sat down. I smiled. I ate the first course. But I noticed, during the reception, I got up to find James. I wanted to dance with him. We had a song, Nat King Cole, Unforgettable, that Gerald used to play in the bakery on Sunday mornings, and James had promised me, when he told me about the wedding plans, that we would dance to it. I found him near the bar with Priya. I touched his arm. He turned. Before I could say anything, Priya leaned in close to him and said something in his ear. Her eyes were on me while she said it. James looked uncomfortable. He looked the way he used to look when he was 8 years old and had done something he knew was wrong and was waiting to be found out. Mom, he said, can you just give us a minute? I just wanted to dance, I said. He nodded. Later. Okay. Later. Okay. Later. Nata never came. About 40 minutes after that, one of Priya's bridesmaids, a young woman I had never met, wearing a dress the colour of sage, approached me where I was sitting with Claudette and said, very quietly, Mrs. Prude, Warren, Priya asked me to let you know that some of the guests are feeling a little crowded near the dance area. She was wondering if you and your guest might be more comfortable in the garden. I looked at her. She had the grace to look away. The garden, I said. There are heaters out there, she said, and the view is really beautiful. Claudette put her hand on my arm. I picked up my clutch. I said, please tell my son I said goodnight. And I walked out. I didn't cry in the parking lot. I didn't cry in the parking lot. I didn't cry on the drive back. Claudette didn't say a word the whole way home, which is the most loving thing she has ever done for me. We stopped at a diner in Petaluma, and I had coffee, and she had pie, and we sat in a vinyl booth at 11 o'clock at night, and I looked out the window at the dark highway and I thought, I built something for 40 years, and I am 63 years old, and my son just let someone ask me to leave his wedding. That was the thought. The whole thought, start to finish. I paid the check and we drove home. He called the next morning. James. At 8:47, while I was standing in the bakery kitchen on autopilot, doing the thing I always do when I don't know what to do, which is make bread. Mom, good morning, I said. Silence. How are you? I'm fine, I said. How was the rest of the evening? More silence. Then I'm sorry about last night. It was a lot of moving parts and Priya was stressed and James. Yeah. Don't explain it that way. He was quiet for a long moment. I could hear him breathing. Then he said, we need to talk about the bakery. I set down the dough scraper. Okay, I said. Priya has some ideas for the space. I think it might be time to talk about the future, about what happens with it long term. The future, I repeated. You're not getting younger, Mom. And the building, Gerald's share, is technically part of the estate, which means it's in kind of a grey area legally, and Priya's colleagues think it would make sense to maybe restructure how the ownership is documented. I was very still. She thinks I should sign it over, I said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer right away. It would stay in the family, he said. It would just be James. My voice was very quiet. Your father and I built that bakery. It has been in operation for 37 years. It employs 11 people. It paid for your college education, your orthodontia, the coat your father wore to your high school graduation. It is the only thing I have left of him that I can touch. Silence. I'm not signing anything, I said. Not today. Not this week. He started to say something. I said, I'll talk to you soon, and I ended the call. I stood in the kitchen for a very long time. Then I called my attorney. Her name is Rosalind. She's been my attorney for 19 years, since Gerald and I first started thinking seriously about estate planning after his first health scare. She has a dry sense of humour and a habit of letting long silences sit without filling them, which I have always appreciated. I told her everything, the call, Priya's questions about the supplier contracts, the seating, the bridesmaid and the garden, James's mention of restructuring ownership. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, Adeline, how is the bakery currently titled? Gerald and I were co-owners. When he passed, his attorney at the time, not you, this was before you, said that his share would pass to me through survivorship rights. We had a joint tenancy agreement. Okay, so you own it outright. Yes. And has anyone presented you with any documents to sign? Anything at all? Not yet. Good, she said. Let's make sure it stays that way. And let's take some steps. We met that Friday. She explained the options clearly. A living trust, specifically structured so that the bakery would remain in my control entirely during my lifetime and pass according to my explicit instructions afterward. Not to James by default, not to a spouse of James by any means, to whoever I chose, when I chose, under conditions I set. A family member recommending you restructure something you've owned outright for decades should be examined very carefully, Rosalind said, in the careful, neutral tone she uses when she's actually saying something important, especially when that recommendation comes shortly after a significant emotional event. I looked at her. I know, I said. I signed the trust documents that same afternoon. James called 3 more times that week. The first call I didn't answer. The second, I answered and said I was busy and I'd call him back. The third time I picked up and he said, Mom, we need to move forward on the bakery conversation. Priya has a meeting with a developer who's interested in the building and she thinks, stop, I said. He stopped. A developer, I said. It's just a conversation, he said. Just exploring, James. I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me. Okay, did your wife marry you because she loves you? Silence. What kind of question is that? I think you know what kind of question it is, I said. Because I think somewhere, underneath all of this, you know something isn't right. I think you felt it before I did. And I think the reason you're pushing this so hard right now isn't because you believe it's the right thing. It's because it's easier to push me than it is to look at what's standing next to you. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, that's not fair. No, I said. None of this is. I told him the bakery was protected. I told him I had met with my attorney and that the ownership structure had been updated and that no document involving the property would be valid without my explicit, witnessed in-person consent. I told him this calmly and without anger, because I was not angry. I was sad in the way that only mothers can be sad, the deep, marrow-level grief of watching someone you gave everything to choose something less. He said, You're punishing me. I said, I'm protecting what your father and I built. And then I said the thing I had been holding since that night in the parking lot in Sonoma. 4 words, simple ones. I love you, James. He didn't respond. I waited. Then, "I love you too, Mom." "Then figure out what you actually want," I said, "before it's too late for you to have it." That was 3 months ago. A lot has happened in 3 months. Priya did meet with the developer. I know this because one of my regulars, a woman named Barbara who has been coming in every Tuesday for 15 years for a cranberry walnut loaf, mentioned she'd seen a man in a suit taking photographs of the building from across the street on a Wednesday afternoon. What he found. Whatever he found, it doesn't matter. The building is in trust. It cannot be sold or transferred without my direction. I made sure of that. James and Priya are still married. I don't know what their marriage looks like from the inside. I hope it is better than I fear it is. I hope I am wrong about what I think I saw in her eyes at the reception. I hope my son is happy. But I have stopped waiting for him to come back to me with answers. What I do know is this. 2 weeks ago, on a Tuesday morning, James walked into the bakery. Not with Priya. Alone. He sat at the table by the window, the same one where he did his homework when he was small, and he ordered a coffee and one of the morning rolls his father used to eat warm with butter. He didn't ask about the trust. He didn't mention the developer. He just sat there and drank his coffee while I worked. After about an hour, he came to the counter and he said, very quietly, "I'm sorry, Mom." I looked at my son. 63 years old, and I could still see the 8-year-old in his face. I could still see the 8-year-old in his face. I could still see Gerald in the line of his jaw. "I know," I said. He nodded. He put on his jacket. At the door, he turned around and said, "The sourdough is better than it's ever been." "I've had a lot of time to work on it," I said. He almost smiled. Then he left. I stood behind the counter for a moment, listening to the small sounds of the kitchen. The oven timer, the refrigerator hum, the low murmur of 2 customers at the far table, the smell of coffee and warm bread, and something that cannot be named, only recognized. 40 years of mornings that looked like this one. Gerald is gone. But his hands are in this flour, in these walls, in the recipe cards taped inside the cabinet door in his handwriting, which I will never take down. My son walked out at my bakery on a Tuesday morning, and I let him go, and I did not chase him. That is the hardest thing I have ever done, and I have done very hard things. But what I have learned in 63 years, and especially in these last 3 months, is that you cannot protect a relationship by giving up the ground you stand on. You cannot love someone into treating you with dignity. You cannot hand over the thing that anchors you and hope that the gesture will be enough. Some things are not ours to give away. Not the land, not the building, not the work of decades, not the memory of a man who called you Addie and believed in you before you believed in yourself. Those things are not gifts we offer. They are what we refuse to let be taken. If you are listening to this and you have something worth protecting, a home, a business, a piece of land that your own hands built, please do not wait until someone you love asks you to sign it away. Talk to an attorney. Set up a trust. Know your rights. Love your children fiercely. But know the difference between love and surrender. I am Adeline Warren. I have been awake since 4:30 this morning. My bakery opens at 6. The sourdough is proofing, and everything that matters is still mine. I used to think that betrayal came loud, that it announced itself, that you would know it when it arrived because it would feel like a door slamming or a voice raised or something sharp and sudden that you could point to and say, "There, that is where it happened." But that is not how it came for me. It came in a bridesmaid's polite smile, in a seating chart, in the way my son looked at me from across a room and looked away, in a phone call the morning after his wedding where his voice was careful in a way that voices only get when someone has been coached. I have spent a lot of time thinking about cause and effect since then, not in any grand or abstract sense, just in the plain, practical way that a woman in her 60s thinks about it when she is standing in a kitchen at 5 in the morning with flour on her hands and a decision to make. Every action plants something. Every choice grows into whatever it was always going to grow into, given the right conditions. Priya did not become who she showed herself to be at that reception overnight. James did not learn to look away from me in a single season. Those things had been growing for a long time. I just had not wanted to see them, and I had to sit with my part in that. The wanting not to see, the choosing to interpret the audit-style questions about my supplier contracts as nervousness, the telling myself that the comment about modernizing the storefront was just her way of making conversation. I am not a woman who lacks perception. I simply loved my son enough to set my perception aside, which is a thing mothers do and which costs us sometimes more than we know. What I understand now is that protecting something is not the same as withholding love. I did not put the bakery in trust because I stopped loving James. I did it because love without boundaries is not love, it is just availability, and I had been available, fully and without condition, for 37 years. Gerald and I built something real with our hands and our savings and our 6 days a week mornings, and that reality did not dissolve because someone decided it was an asset to be restructured. There is a kind of wisdom that only comes from having lived long enough to lose things you cannot replace. I lost Gerald. I know what irreversible feels like, and I made a decision, sitting across from Rosalind in her office with the rings on the wooden table, that I would not lose this too. Not through carelessness, not through the particular weakness of wanting to keep the peace. James came back. He sat at the window table and he ate a morning roll and he said he was sorry, and I believed him, not because I'm naive, but because I know my son's face and I know what real looks like on it. What happens next between us I cannot say. I do not know what his marriage looks like from the inside. I do not know if Priya will change or if he will find the courage to see clearly. Those are not things I can control. What I can control is this bakery, this kitchen, the recipe cards in Gerald's handwriting, the 11 people who show up every morning because this place is still standing. If you are holding something that took you decades to build, do not let anyone make you feel that protecting it is the same as being difficult. It is not. It is the most honest thing you can do, for yourself, for the people who built it beside you, and, though they may not understand it yet, for the people who come after you. I am Adeline. The oven is on. The dough is ready, and everything I have ever refused to give away is still exactly where I left it.